You think you know wild animals. Until one day, a bobcat walks right out of the forest and lays her dying kitten at your feet. No threats, no growls, just desperate eyes begging for help. In the rugged wilderness of Colorado, a lone biologist faces a choice that defies every rule of nature: turn away or cross a line no human should. What follows is not a fairy tale. It's raw, silent, and real. In a world where survival means staying wild, one animal breaks the code. And what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about trust. The wild does not knock, it waits and watches. Strangers in the wild. The late September air in the San Juan Mountains was already turning sharp, slicing through the pine canopy and whistling low across the alpine meadows. The trees stood tall and stoic, their needles trembling in the wind. But for David Lancaster, it was the silence that defined this place. Not the absence of sound, but a presence, deep and breathing, like the forest itself was alive and aware. David stepped out of his log cabin and inhaled deeply. The scent of wet soil, pine resin, and distant wood smoke drifted on the breeze. He sipped from his metal coffee mug, its handle warm from the fire he'd just banked inside. Dressed in layered flannel and insulated pants, he looked every bit the rugged field biologist he was, though the unshaved stubble on his jaw and the faint circles under his eyes hinted at someone more human than hero. He had come to San Juan National Forest alone, by choice. 39 years old and on a voluntary sabbatical from his position at a Denver research institute, David was a man looking for more than just data. The last 2 years had hollowed him, first from the strain of overwork, then from the sudden loss of his wife, Elise. The forest, in all its ruthless neutrality, had offered the one thing no person could: peace without judgment. Each day was nearly identical. Up at dawn, brew coffee, hike the trail loops for motion sensor footage, record scat patterns, log predator markings, primarily coyotes, foxes, and the occasional mountain lion. Then back to the cabin to enter data, cook a simple meal, and wait for sleep. But this morning was different. It started as a subtle unease, an instinct he didn't yet trust. As he stepped off his porch to check the trail near the eastern ridge, he noticed prints in the soil by the steps. Not deer, not coyote, something quieter, rounder. Bobcat. He crouched down beside them, brushing his gloved fingers across the fresh indentations. The rear pads were wide, and the front slightly splayed. No claw marks. That confirmed it. A solitary feline had come within 10 feet of his cabin. Not unusual, perhaps, but uncommon this close to human scent. As he stood and scanned the tree line, a shape caught his eye. A flicker of movement near the ridge, fast and low. A tail, short and thick, vanished into the underbrush. His breath caught in his throat. Not out of fear, but fascination. Bobcats were notoriously elusive, even to seasoned trackers. Seeing one in broad daylight, practically unheard of. He stayed still for a moment, heart pulsing in his ears, then made a note in his logbook. Time, direction, behavior. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but that image, those tawny, spotted haunches disappearing into the wild, remained stamped on his thoughts. That evening, after supper, he stepped outside again. The sun had dropped behind the mountains, leaving only amber streaks across the darkening sky. The chill had deepened, but something warmer moved under his skin, a tension he couldn't shake, and then he saw it. Just beyond the clearing, where the pine shadows met the open space, she stood, low to the ground, tense but unafraid. A North American bobcat, unmistakable in her tawny coat and black, tufted ears. Her eyes caught his in the fading light, amber, sharp, and startlingly expressive. But she wasn't alone. Dangling from her jaws was a limp shape, a kitten, small and bloodied. One foreleg twisted unnaturally. David's breath locked in his chest. She padded forward, step by careful step, until she reached the edge of the porch. Then she stopped. No snarl, no retreat. Just one long moment where predator met man in a fragile truce. She lowered the kitten gently onto the wood, then stepped back into the dark and waited. David froze, his eyes locked on the motionless form now resting just inches from the toe of his boot. The kitten, a bobcat barely larger than a house cat, lay sprawled on the porch boards, its fur matted with blood, chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic rhythm. One tiny paw twitched. David's heart thudded, not with fear but with an instinct even older than caution, the urge to help. He glanced back at the mother. She hadn't moved. 20 feet away, partially concealed by the tree line, she crouched low, ears erect, eyes burning like twin embers in the dusk. She didn't growl. She didn't retreat. She simply watched, a plea without sound. David took a slow step forward, half expecting her to vanish. She didn't. Kneeling beside the kitten, he hesitated for the briefest of moments, then pulled off his glove. The kitten's fur was warm beneath his fingers but sticky. He could see the injury now, a deep puncture along the shoulder, likely from another bobcat, possibly a rival male. The leg hung limp, likely dislocated or fractured. He looked up again. The mother's expression hadn't changed. Still, she watched. Not a threat, not a test, just trust. "All right," he murmured, barely louder than the wind. "I hear you." With the gentlest hands he could manage, David lifted the kitten into his arms, wrapping it quickly in the bottom of his flannel shirt. It gave a weak, breathy mewl, then went still again. The weight of the moment pressed in, not just the fragile body in his arms, but the understanding between species that defied logic. Behind him, the wooden porch creaked under his boots as he turned toward the cabin door. As he stepped inside, he glanced one last time toward the trees. She was still there, still watching, still waiting. Inside, he placed the kitten on a folded blanket on the table, fingers trembling as he opened his field kit. The antiseptic, the tweezers, the medical gauze, his tools of research, not of rescue. But tonight, they would have to do both. And outside in the dark, a mother waited in silence, not knowing if her final act of trust would save her only child or break her heart. Between life and death lies only seconds, and someone willing to try. The fragile life. The inside of the cabin smelled faintly of pine tar and old coffee, a scent David had long come to associate with solitude. But now the air felt different, charged, heavy. The tiny bundle on the table barely moved. Its shallow breathing whispered louder than any storm. David set to work. He rinsed his hands in cold water, scrubbing fast, not for sterility. He had no surgical suite, but to calm the adrenaline pulsing through his veins. The bobcat kitten lay curled on a folded blanket, swaddled in part of his shirt. Its golden fur was streaked with blood, the wound just above the shoulder still oozing. Grabbing his field med kit, he pulled out a bottle of iodine, a clean syringe for flushing, and a small pair of tweezers. He whispered aloud as he worked, not words of comfort, but steadying thoughts, as if narrating the steps could ground him. Laceration, just above the scapula, deep but clean. No sign of festering yet. He lifted the injured leg gently. The kitten hissed, a tiny, pained sound, then whimpered. David winced along with it. The joint was loose, dislocated at best, broken at worst. He couldn't know without x-rays. All he could do was clean the wound, stop the bleeding, and pray infection didn't set in. He flushed the area with sterilized water, then dabbed iodine gently with gauze. The kitten trembled beneath his fingers. Not a struggle, just the shivering release of pain it could no longer resist. David worked quickly, wrapping the limb and stabilizing it with the lightest splint he could fashion from a coffee stirrer and tape. He didn't notice the tears until one dropped onto the wooden table. It wasn't just the kitten, it was the weight of it all. The trust from a wild predator, the absurd intimacy of tending to something so raw and helpless, the crushing memory of the hospital room where he hadn't been able to do anything at all. He shook the thought away. This wasn't about him. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. David poured warm water into a shallow bowl and added a dash of powdered goat milk from his rations. He dipped a cloth into the mixture and touched it to the kitten's lips. No response. He tried again, gentler, with a dropper this time. The kitten's tongue twitched. A drop, then another. Slowly, so slowly, the tiny creature swallowed. David exhaled. Outside, the wind howled and rattled the window pane. He glanced through the crack in the curtain. There she was. The mother bobcat still sat just beyond the edge of the porch light. Her shape barely moved, but her presence was undeniable. Eyes locked onto the window, a statue of wild patience. David pulled a blanket off his cot and laid it on the floor beside the table. Then, with careful hands, he lowered the kitten, now wrapped fully in soft cloth, into a nest of warmth. He sat beside her, not daring to sleep, listening to every labored breath. The mother didn't move, not even when the lamp flickered, not even when the hour passed into night. And David, for the first time in a very long time, whispered something out loud, not to himself, but to her. "I'll do everything I can." No response, but none was needed. She already knew. Night settled like a heavy cloak over the forest, muffling the usual rustles and calls. Inside the cabin, the only sounds were the slow tick of a wall clock and the kitten's shallow breathing, rasping softly in the stillness. David sat cross-legged on the floor beside the table, his hand resting gently near the kitten's nest of blankets. Every few minutes, he reached out to check her warmth, adjusting the cloth if the chill crept in. He didn't dare sleep. This fragile little life was skating the edge of death, and he wasn't about to look away. He stole glances toward the window, where the porch light spilled a golden circle onto the wooden boards outside. And still, she was there. The mother bobcat had not moved. Perched just beyond the light's reach, she lay crouched like a silent sculpture, ears angled toward the cabin, body taut but calm. She hadn't made a sound, not a growl, not a hiss, yet her presence was louder than thunder. It struck David how unnatural this was. Wild predators didn't linger around human dwellings. Not like this, and certainly not in silence. Yet she remained, hour after hour, watching, not threatening, just waiting. He wondered how long she'd been observing him before that night. Had she watched him gather samples, log data, hike through the woods? Had she sensed something in him, something safe? He thought of the long days alone, the nights filled only with wind and old memories. He had come here to escape the noise of the world, but never expected the silence to speak back. Around midnight, the kitten stirred, a faint movement of her paw. David leaned in, hopeful. Her breath was steadier now, shallow, but no longer erratic, a flicker of life that hadn't been there hours ago. Outside, the wind shifted. Pine boughs swayed. The mother bobcat blinked, slow, deliberate. He pressed his palm to the glass, a quiet gesture not of control, but connection. "We're not so different," he said, voice low. Beyond the pane, amber eyes stared back, unblinking. It wasn't a bond, not yet, but it was a beginning. You don't tame the wild. You earn the right to stand beside it. A wild pact. The following days unfolded like fragile glass, each moment precious, each movement deliberate. David barely left the cabin. His world had narrowed to the space between the old wooden table and the soft blanket-lined corner where the bobcat kitten, Luna, lay recovering. He hadn't meant to name her. It just slipped out. A whispered syllable in the dead of night when she stirred slightly and blinked up at him with those cloudy blue eyes. Luna. The name stuck. Each morning began with a quiet check of her vitals. Her breathing was stronger now. The fever had broken. She even managed to lift her head once to sniff at the bowl of warm goat milk David placed near her nose. He didn't cheer, didn't speak. It felt sacred, like clapping in a cathedral. The wound, though still raw and angry, showed no signs of infection. David irrigated it twice daily, replacing the dressing with sterile gauze, adjusting the splint when needed. It wasn't perfect. He wasn't a vet, but it was holding. Outside the cabin, the mother bobcat remained, always at the edge. Sometimes she lay in full view, stretched out just beyond the porch steps, her eyes tracking his every move. Other times, she disappeared into the woods, only to return at dusk, reclaiming her post with a silent grace that defied understanding. She didn't pace, didn't growl, just waited. David began to speak to her, not for communication but to fill the aching silence. He'd read once that wild animals respond to tone, not words. So he kept his voice low, steady, non-threatening. "Her temp's holding steady today," he'd say, peeking through the curtain. "Still not eating much, but she's got some fight in her." The bobcat never responded. But sometimes, just as he turned away, he thought he saw her blink. Slowly, deliberately. One night, while boiling water for a compress, David heard something he hadn't expected. A soft growl. He froze. It came from the floor near the fireplace. Luna had pulled herself upright, wobbly, panting but upright. She was staring at the crack under the door, the little tuft of her tail twitching. David followed her gaze. A mouse. He almost laughed. Instinct was returning. That was good. That was wild. Still, he reminded himself, she wasn't out of danger. Her leg was healing, yes, but awkwardly, without proper imaging. He couldn't tell if the bone was aligned. A bad break, untreated, could leave her crippled. He needed help. That night, by lantern light, David drafted a message on his satellite phone to Dr. Emma Rhodes, a wildlife vet and his closest contact at the Durango Recovery Center. He hesitated over the words. Subject: emergency field case. Message: injured bobcat kitten approximately 8 weeks. Leg trauma. No sign of infection. Rehab progress good, but unsure of fracture severity. X-rays needed. Situation unusual. Explanation in person. He hit send. Then, he looked through the window again. The mother bobcat was back, sitting now, upright, regal. David nodded to her. "She's not giving up, neither am I." The two sat there, separated by wood and glass, wilderness and reason, but bound by something neither could explain. Not ownership and not control, just a silent pact. By morning, the wind had picked up, rattling the tin roof like scattered bones. The sky over the mountains was bruised with storm clouds, heavy with the promise of rain or snow, or both. David stood on the porch, his flannel collar pulled tight against his neck, staring into the woods. The mother bobcat was gone. It was the first morning she hadn't been there, not lying in the tall grass, not sitting by the tree line. Gone. David's chest tightened. Had he broken the thread? Had she decided he wasn't trustworthy after all? That he'd failed? He turned back inside, trying to push the thoughts away. Luna was stirring in her blanket nest. She lifted her head when he entered, eyes brighter now, pupils wide and reactive. She hissed softly as he approached, a sound that should have worried him, but didn't. It meant she was healing. She was remembering who she was. But her leg, still not right. When she tried to shift her weight, she collapsed with a pitiful mule. That settled it. David packed quickly. Gauze, disinfectant, Luna's milk powder, even his worn fleece blanket to line the crate. He fashioned a transport carrier out of a reinforced research supply box, cutting ventilation slits into the sides, padding the interior. Luna watched him warily, ears twitching, but too tired to resist when he gently lifted her in. Just as he locked the latch, thunder cracked overhead. He loaded her into the back seat of his beat-up 4x4 and climbed behind the wheel. The drive to Durango would take nearly 2 hours, depending on the storm, and the red dirt roads would turn to sludge fast. He couldn't afford to get stuck. As the truck rumbled to life, David glanced one last time toward the woods and froze. She was there, not at the porch, not hiding, standing in the middle of the clearing. The mother bobcat. Her coat glistened with the first drops of rain, her amber eyes burning with silent intensity. She didn't move, didn't blink. David rolled down the window. "I have to take her," he said aloud, voice cracking. The bobcat's ears flicked at the sound. No growl, no step forward, just a frozen statue in the mist. He placed a hand gently on the crate beside him. "I'll bring her back." Then, slowly, David shifted into drive and began to roll forward. The bobcat remained where she stood, watching. As he disappeared down the muddy trail, he couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror. She hadn't moved, but he could feel it. Her gaze still on him, fierce and unblinking. Trust, or something close to it. And now, everything depended on what happened next. When science and instinct collide, only truth can walk away unharmed. Between two worlds, the storm broke hard just 10 miles out of camp. Rain pelted the windshield like gravel, turning the dirt road into a river of red sludge. The truck skidded on the hairpin turns along the mountain pass, tires groaning in protest. David's hands gripped the wheel with white-knuckled tension, eyes flicking between the wipers and the crate beside him. Inside, Luna whimpered softly with each jolt. The painkillers he'd administered before leaving were likely wearing off. David reached over at a stop sign to adjust the blanket, speaking in a calm voice she probably didn't understand, but maybe felt. "We're almost there, little one. Just hold on." By the time he pulled into the Durango Wildlife Recovery Center, the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle. The center, nestled on the edge of the forest preserve, looked like a hybrid between a clinic and a ranger outpost. Clean, structured, sterile. Unnatural. Dr. Emma Rhodes met him at the entrance, raincoat flapping in the wind, her short blonde hair damp around her face. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed and grounded, with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd stitched up more claws and beaks than most people saw in a lifetime. "Let's see what you've got," she said, ushering him inside. David set the crate down on the metal table. Emma opened the lid slowly, eyes narrowing as Luna blinked up at her from beneath the fleece. One look at the splinted leg and the exposed wound told her enough. "You did this in the field?" she asked, reaching for gloves. David nodded. "Didn't have a choice." She didn't question further. The air between them was all movement now. Hands, tools, quick commands to the assistant. They placed Luna under a warm lamp and prepped the X-ray table. David stood back, silent but ever present, as the images rolled across the screen. Emma squinted. Hairline fracture along the scapula. Not displaced, but borderline. You got real lucky. So did she, David said quietly. Emma turned to him. You know this isn't normal, right? Bobcats don't bring their kits to humans. They vanish, hide them, or die trying. I know, he said, but she didn't run. She watched. She's still watching. He told her everything. The porch, the silent stare, the nights under the stars, the feeling of being judged and somehow chosen. Emma didn't scoff. She looked out the window, rain tapping the glass like a ticking clock. She brought you a responsibility, not a gift, she said. This kitten might recover, but if she can't hunt, she can't return. And that mother, she might never understand why. David's throat tightened. The truth hit harder than the storm. He hadn't just crossed a boundary. He was living in its shadow. "We'll do the surgery," Emma continued, checking Luna's vitals. "Pin the fracture, stitch the muscle, monitor for 3 days. If all goes well, you take her back." "And if it doesn't?" Emma didn't answer. She didn't need to. David stepped outside for air as the anesthesia settled over Luna like a pale cloud. He looked toward the tree line in the far distance. Somewhere out there, a mother waited. Or grieved. And all he could do now was make the wait worth it. The surgery lasted nearly 2 hours. David sat outside the operating room, staring blankly at a knot in the pine flooring, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. Through the observation glass, he could see Luna's small frame under the sterile drape, one hind leg exposed, a team of focused hands working to insert the surgical pin and realign the muscle tissue. Every beep from the monitor was a countdown, every shift in Emma's posture a silent judgment on whether this had been the right choice. When the door finally opened, Emma stepped out, pulling off her gloves. "She made it," she said simply. David exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since dawn. "She's sedated. We'll monitor her overnight. If there's no fever or swelling, she can travel tomorrow." He nodded. Relief flooded him, but only for a second. Because now came the harder part, the return. That night, David stayed in a ranger bunkhouse, but he barely slept. His mind spun with questions that had no answers. Would the mother bobcat still be there? Had she already moved on? Would she recognize her own offspring, or reject the scent of human medicine clinging to her fur? By sunrise, Luna was awake, groggy but alert. The pin held, and her vitals were steady. They eased her back into the crate, cushioning it carefully, and loaded her into the truck once more. The drive home felt longer than the drive out. When he finally pulled into the clearing near his cabin, the air was still. The storm had passed, leaving behind the rich, clean scent of wet pine and earth. The porch was empty. David stepped out, lifting the crate gently. He opened the cabin door and placed Luna inside on the same folded blanket she had left behind. Then he left the door ajar and waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. No movement in the trees, no shape in the brush. David stepped onto the porch and gave a low whistle. Not a call, but a sound he'd used over the past days while talking gently into the woods. A pattern, a rhythm, then movement. A shadow along the ridge, quiet, deliberate. The mother bobcat emerged. She did not rush. She did not run. She walked forward, step by slow step, until she stood at the edge of the porch. She lifted her nose to the air and sniffed. Her ears twitched. Her eyes locked onto David, hard, unreadable. He stepped back. The crate inside the door was open. From it, Luna gave a soft mewl. That was all it took. The mother stepped inside. One step, then another. She approached the kitten, sniffed her gently. A pause, a long one. Then she lay beside her, silent, protective, and still. David watched from the porch, heart pounding. The test had come, and somehow he had passed. Some bonds are built not with words, but with breath shared in silence. The return. The days that followed unfolded like the slow turning of a forgotten page. Inside the cabin, Luna lay nestled against her mother, recovering with a new calmness in her tiny body. The wound had been stitched. The pin had been set. But the real healing, the kind that defied medicine, was happening now in silence, beside the one who had brought her into the world and nearly lost her to it. David kept his distance. He moved quietly, deliberately. Every time he entered the room, he made a soft noise first, announcing his presence, not intruding. He left bowls of water and soft meat shavings near the door, then stepped away. The mother bobcat, whom he now called Sora in his notes, tolerated him with the still, measured grace of a sovereign in a foreign land. She did not flee. She did not attack. She watched. And that alone felt like a miracle. Each morning, David documented Luna's progress. The swelling had subsided. Her appetite had returned. When she took her first few limping steps across the cabin floor, slow, wobbly, but determined, he didn't cheer. He simply smiled to himself, heart lifting with quiet pride. Sora observed everything. Her eyes followed every movement. She didn't interfere, but she never stopped watching. There was an intelligence in her gaze that went beyond instinct. Something ancient, aware. The door remained open during the day. Sora would sometimes slip outside into the trees, vanish into the underbrush for hours, then return with something freshly killed. Quail, hare, even once a mouse. She never brought the prey inside. She dropped it near the porch, then resumed her vigil, just out of reach. David took it as her version of gratitude, or perhaps tribute, or maybe something he couldn't define. One afternoon, while checking Luna's bandage, David accidentally brushed Sora's paw. She didn't flinch, didn't growl. Instead, she blinked, slow, heavy-lidded. A wild animal's nod, the kind of gesture one could miss if they weren't paying attention. He whispered, "You're not just surviving, you're choosing." By the end of the week, Luna had begun to explore short stretches of the cabin floor. Her limp was still noticeable, but less pronounced. She tested her balance against table legs, pounced softly on shadows, watched birds through the window with sharpened focus. Predator instincts were returning, and so was the restlessness. That's when David knew. They wouldn't stay much longer. He'd hoped for more time, another week, maybe two. But Sora's glances toward the trees grew longer each day. Her movements sharper, her body coiled like it remembered its shape in the wild. She wasn't meant to stay here. Neither was Luna. One evening, as the sky bled orange behind the peaks, David sat on the porch with a mug of tea growing cold in his hands. Sora emerged from the cabin, Luna trailing after her, more confident now in her steps. They paused at the edge of the clearing. Sora looked back at him. Not a farewell, not a request, just acknowledgement. Then they vanished into the trees, quiet as shadows. No sound, no promise, just the wind and the knowledge that something unexplainable had happened here. Something real. The final glance. The clearing felt impossibly quiet after they disappeared. David sat unmoving, his hands curled loosely around the now cold mug. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only streaks of purple and amber trailing across the Colorado sky. Crickets began their nightly chorus. A lone owl hooted somewhere near the ridge. But to David it all sounded muffled, like a world just beginning to exhale after holding its breath. They were gone. No crack of branches. No whisper of paw prints. Just absence. He should have felt relief, gratitude, maybe even triumph. Luna had survived. Her leg, though not perfect, would allow her to move, climb, and maybe someday hunt. Sora had stayed long enough to ensure that. Long enough to trust him. Instead, all he felt was the echo of their presence. He stood and walked into the cabin, its walls suddenly too still. The fleece blanket lay rumpled in the corner where Luna had slept. A small tuft of her fur clung to its edge. Nearby, one of the toy mice he had fashioned out of twine and cotton, half-chewed, abandoned mid-play. David picked it up, turning it over in his hand like a relic. He walked to the doorway and leaned against the frame, letting the twilight wash over him. This place had always been his refuge, a shelter from the noise of the world, the burden of past regrets. But for those few weeks, it had become something else, a bridge between worlds, between instinct and trust, between species that were supposed to fear each other. The moment replayed again in his mind, Sora at the edge of the woods, glancing back, not lingering, but not rushing either. That was the final gift. Not a stare of dependence or loss, but recognition. David stepped off the porch, walked to the spot where the two had paused before vanishing. The grass was slightly pressed, the soil disturbed by their final footprints. He knelt and placed a hand over the prints. Cool now, fading already. "We were never meant to keep each other," he whispered. "Only to meet." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and earth, rustling the leaves in soft approval. He stood slowly and turned back toward the cabin. Behind him, the forest held its secrets. Ahead, life would return to its quiet rhythm of field logs and solitary hikes. But it would never be the same. Because somewhere in the Colorado wilderness, a young bobcat named Luna was finding her place in the world again, stronger, braver, and carrying a piece of a man who once sat beside her through the night. And he would carry her too, always. Some stories don't end, they ripple. Echoes of the wild. Weeks passed. The snow came late that year, frosting the pine branches in the higher elevations, but leaving the lower valley where David's cabin sat mostly dry. He resumed his research, tracking migration patterns, logging changes in wildlife behaviors. But something had shifted. Every trail felt different. Not lonelier, just deeper. He often found himself pausing mid-hike to scan the ridgelines, listening for paw steps that never came. He didn't expect them to. That was never part of the deal. But still, there were signs. A set of small, neat paw prints along the frozen stream bed, spaced wider than they had been before. A shredded pine squirrel carcass, left near the south trailhead, half covered by leaves. Even once, a patch of fur caught on a branch, golden-tipped with faint black spotting, just enough to make him pause, heart aching and full. He never chased the sightings, never called out. That wasn't what their connection had been about. Instead, he left the blanket, the old fleece, folded and tucked beneath the overhang by the woodshed, not as bait, not as invitation, just as a marker, like the corner of a shared memory, quietly held in case it was ever needed again. Then, one morning, it was gone. No signs of struggle, no tufts of fur, just the soft indentation in the frost where it had rested the night before. And now, nothing. He stood there for a long time, staring at the emptiness with a faint smile playing on his lips. They were out there, together. He returned to town occasionally for supplies, and it wasn't long before whispers started floating around the local diner and ranger station. "You hear about the bobcat sighting near the lake?" Someone spotted a female with a limp and a young one close behind, real close. David never commented, but inside, a quiet warmth bloomed. Luna was growing, strong enough to roam, strong enough to survive. Sora had waited, watched, and chosen the moment to bring her daughter home. One evening, while logging observations in his field journal, David paused mid-sentence. He flipped to the first page, a blank space he'd left when he began the new season. Carefully, he wrote, "The wild came to my doorstep once, not to be tamed, but to trust. I did not deserve it, but I answered anyway." He closed the journal, stood, and stepped out into the growing dusk. The wind carried the faintest sound, a rustle too large for a rabbit, too quiet for a deer. He didn't turn. Instead, he smiled and whispered to the trees, "I know you're out there." Somewhere beyond the ridge, two shadows slipped through the trees, low to the ground, swift, silent. And the wild, for one brief moment, felt a little closer than it had in years. Spring arrived early the following year. The mountain thaw melted into streams that sang through the valleys, and green returned to the forest in soft waves. David resumed his work with the quiet rhythm of someone no longer searching, but still always listening. He had stopped expecting them. That didn't mean he forgot. The fleece blanket never returned. Neither did the paw prints. No more signs, no more shadows, not even a rustle that teased the edge of hope. Yet somehow, he knew they were fine. That trust, once honored, didn't need reminders. It simply existed, like gravity, silent, invisible, constant. His cabin had become more than a shelter. It was now a place of stories whispered in low voices when researchers and rangers visited. Some believed him. Others offered polite nods and quick changes of topic. But no one dismissed the legend entirely. Not in a place like this. Then, one morning, David stepped outside and froze. There, at the edge of the porch, lay something small, a tuft of fur, tawny, faintly spotted, freshly shed. He bent down, fingertips brushing it gently. It wasn't from the mother. It was juvenile. He glanced toward the tree line. Nothing moved, no sound, no shapes in the shadows. But he smiled, because it wasn't just a sign. It was a message. She had come back, not for help, not for safety, just to let him know. Luna was no longer a kitten. She had grown, healthy, strong enough to hunt, to roam, perhaps even to begin a lineage of her own. David placed the fur inside his journal, pressed between pages filled with data and sketches, not as a specimen, as a story. Later that evening, he sat on the porch, watching the sun descend behind the trees that had once framed a bobcat silhouette. He sipped warm tea from his favorite tin mug and leaned back in the creaking wooden chair. No ceremony, no last look, just peace. He had done what he was meant to do. Not save, not change, just care. From the moment Sora placed her fragile cub on the porch, something had shifted in the silence between man and wild. Not permanently, not universally, but enough. Enough to prove that sometimes, when the world seems divided by fear and instinct, a silent pact can form between two souls who were never supposed to meet. And for David, that was more than enough. Because somewhere out there, in the shadowed folds of Colorado's wilderness, a once wounded bobcat now hunted with grace, climbed with confidence, and carried with her the legacy of a trust given, and never broken. In the quiet wilderness of Colorado, a silent agreement between a man and a wild bobcat mother reminds us of something deeply human. Trust isn't granted. It's earned through presence, patience, and unspoken understanding. This story isn't just about a rescued animal. It's about respect for boundaries, compassion without expectation, and choosing to help even when the outcome is uncertain. In our daily lives, we often encounter those who are hurting, sometimes silently, often from places we don't understand. Like David, we are given moments to choose kindness over convenience, care over comfort. At Paw Prints and Stories, we believe every life, whether furred or not, carries a story worth hearing. If this journey moved you, consider joining our community. There's more ahead, more encounters, more heartbeats in the wild, and more truths hidden between the lines of paw prints in the snow. Here's your challenge. This week, look around. Who in your life needs you to simply stay, without asking for anything in return? Because sometimes the wild comes not to be saved, but to remind us how to be human.